The more time you spend in the land, the more of yourself you give to it, the more it reveals back to you. Since my earliest childhood anyhow, New Mexico is the first place I've lived that does feel like home. I have no sense of wanting to be somewhere else. You can walk off in any given direction, and there's always something to discover, and very often you have the sense that no one has been exactly right where you're standing, or perhaps they were at one time, but it's not as if it's happening every day. There's no sense of pressure, like socially or any other way, that like I'm supposed to be a certain way, or I'm supposed to say a certain thing, or believe a certain thing, or there's the freedom in the land to do what you're meant to do and to be who you're meant to be. You're not so overwhelmed with all the outside noises that confuse us and move us farther away from who we're meant to be, I think. I can fill sketchbooks of drawings when I'm out, or I can find things, objects, whatever, just keep them around. Maybe they become art someday, maybe they don't. I think when we use the word religion broadly, we're just talking about something which separates the sacred from the profane. We want a separate category. We want to say, this is special. Like, it's not a part of the ordinary tasks of everyday life, that it's set aside. Take certain objects out of spaces, and when they're in the space, they're just garbage. And when you take them out of the space and you take them back into the studio and you set them aside and you look at them for a while, they take on a different valence. So just by separating it from the rest, you've sort of sacralized it. And that's where the nothing becomes something. And now, not only is it something, but it's special. And it feels like there's some kind of trace of consciousness in that. Part of the value of dispensing with premeditated meanings is to wait and see what kinds of patterns emerge through a process. And when those patterns start to feel meaningful, then it feels more deeply real than premeditating a concept and then trying to execute that concept. I realized that with Parrot's music, the content is in the form. He figured out a structure that if he trusted it, and he trusted that process, that a voice would speak through it that was larger than his, and that he could get out of the way of. I thought, that's the only way forward. Abandoned elementary school that's in San Antonio, New Mexico is different from the other sites that I've installed in that it was only abandoned 5 years ago. Every space that you're in the present moment, whether it's an art gallery or an art museum or someone's house or whatever, there will come a time where that's not used for those purposes anymore. And so it really puts you in touch with the brevity of all of that. Like I sense the traces of those, whatever its past functions were. I just sense it in the sometimes just even in like the litter that's left behind, or like the decay in the walls or something like this. And I know that kind of weight and that kind of stillness can produce in people an emotion like sadness, but it's not really sadness that I feel when I'm there. It's actually relief. I struggle to feel as if I belong in the culture. And these are places where the cultural impetus behind their original designs have already failed, which all cultures do eventually. In order to belong, there's a cost, and that cost is something like the independent mind. You go along to get along, so to speak. But when you're in these spaces, they're actually indifferent to your arrival. There's an indifference to them, that they continue exactly the way they are after you leave, and they were exactly that way before you arrived. And there isn't any kind of a lie in that, like the kinds of things we do try to comfort ourselves with when things fall apart. There's a just rightness about it. It's perfectly acceptable exactly the way that it is. And that feels like some repatriation to me. That is the proximity of my soul to my soul remembering my soul. And there are a few places that are that quiet and still and honest enough that you can rediscover that. And when I install the work in the space, the most unusual things happen. There's always this kind of synchronicity that occurs. They always feel like they came from the walls, you know? Like the walls themselves gave birth to this work, even though I made them in the studio. But of course I make them for these spaces too. So those paintings are anthropomorphic. And when you hang them in front of the handprints, you have the feeling of being back in the caves where the first artists were making the first art. So it's almost like not only are you back in this space which is no longer used for its original purposes, but you're kind of back in time to this primordial space which sort of overlays the space that you're physically in. So you're not just in the year 2023, you're sort of for that moment in all times and all spaces somehow. It's a beautiful, wonderful, impossible thing to plan or replicate. It was here in this space that I can breathe in, that I understand, that I feel that I belong to. I develop a sense of friendship with land, and particularly with this land, in the way that people might describe developing friendships with people. So when I go back to a familiar place, if I've been there before, I feel welcomed by it. And, you know, I have real interactions with the environment as well. Like if I am in the forest or the desert, or I'm out wandering the arroyos, I always make sure to thank it when I leave. New Mexico just gives me the possibility of reconnecting with something that people have known all along, but that in the time in which we live, it's difficult to have access to.